In a live Capitol Hill showdown watched by millions, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett exposes Snap Inc. CEO Evan Spiegel for using hidden AI to profile and manipulate black teens in swing states. Spiegel calls it innovation, until Jasmine drops the bomb. Damning documents, insider revelations, and evidence so disturbing it leaves the entire chamber in stunned silence. Within 24 hours, Snap's empire crumbles. Stock in freefall, FBI agents raiding its headquarters, and Congress triggering the largest tech probe in U.S. history. Is America's future being rewritten by code designed to control, not protect? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It began with a file, anonymous, encrypted, and unsigned. The subject line read, Project Phantom for eyes only. At first, no one at the Oversight Committee could believe it. The document, allegedly leaked by a former senior engineer at Snap Inc., contained internal screenshots, code snippets, and an annotated flowchart that outlined a disturbing truth. Snapchat had been secretly collecting real-time location, private photo metadata, and behavioral engagement patterns from users as young as 13. Worse, it wasn't just for ads. A hidden AI system had been classifying users by political leaning based on language, emoji use, and even background objects in their photos. One file was titled Pre-Voter Mapping Suburban Teens. Another simply said, Texas, Phase 2. When investigators opened the log file attached, they saw something chilling, a list of 176,204 user IDs labeled with tags like leans left, easily influenced, and convert through fear. This wasn't just a breach of privacy, it was political weaponization aimed at America's most vulnerable. News of the leak hit Capitol Hill like a thunderclap. Within hours, the House Committee on Ethics and Emerging Technologies called an emergency session. A closed-door briefing revealed the full scope. Tens of thousands of minors, targeted through psychological profiling, their data filtered and sorted to fuel hyper-personalized political content. The outrage was bipartisan. Headlines blazed across the country. Snapchat engineered for election influence? In less than 24 hours, subpoenas were issued. And at the center of it all stood one name. Evan Spiegel. The billionaire boy wonder of Silicon Beach was no longer just a tech CEO. He was now the face of what many were calling Gen Z surveillance capitalism. But this time, Congress didn't want PR spin. They wanted accountability. And they turned to someone who had never been afraid to confront the elite in their own language, or burn the playbook entirely. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, chairwoman of the House Subcommittee on Data Ethics and Civil Rights, was chosen to lead the interrogation. She didn't smile when the cameras rolled. She didn't offer pleasantries. Her message was clear from the start. This is not about a glitch. This is about a choice. Someone chose to look at kids not as people, but as assets. And today, we name names. The weight of her words turned every head in the chamber. This wasn't going to be a hearing. This was going to be a reckoning. And as the last lines of Jasmine's warning faded from the national broadcast, the air in room 236 shifted. The door opened, not just for a man, but for the reckoning he had tried for years to avoid. Evan Spiegel stepped into the hearing room, dressed in a sharp navy suit, his signature calm confidence intact. Cameras clicked like gunfire as he passed the packed gallery. He nodded politely to members of Congress, his expression cool, measured, almost too smooth. To the public, he was still the golden boy of Silicon Beach, young, brilliant, and composed. But beneath the surface, the room could feel it. This wasn't just another tech testimony. This was a battlefield. And walking in from the opposite side, wearing no designer armor but radiating something far sharper, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't here for optics. Her stride was steady, her face unreadable. She sat, opened her folder, and didn't even glance at Spiegel. She already knew exactly where the fault lines were. This was the moment where theater ended and accountability began. The chair turned the floor over. Jasmine didn't fumble with her mic. She leaned forward slowly, deliberately, and locked eyes with Evan Spiegel, holding them just long enough to remind him that this wasn't a shareholder meeting. Then she spoke. Mr. Spiegel, she began, her voice even, deliberate, with the calm precision of someone who already knew where the conversation was going. You didn't just sell filters, you sold our children's privacy to political machines. The words hit like a strike to the solar plexus. Audible gasp broke through the back row. A young aide dropped her notebook. A congressman shifted uncomfortably. But Jasmine didn't blink. She let the silence that followed settle into the room like dust from a collapsed ceiling, making everyone breathe in just how real this had become. She didn't need to raise her voice. She had raised the stakes. Evan Spiegel, until then composed, made the smallest motion, adjusting his cuff. But the gesture betrayed a deeper truth. He had lost control of the room. Jasmine continued, her voice unwavering. "We have evidence," she said, pulling a page from her folder, "that your platform labeled underage users as easily influenced and fed them targeted political content without consent, without oversight, and without a shred of accountability." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One of Spiegel's lawyers leaned toward him, whispering something urgent. Jasmine waited, not out of courtesy, but to remind them who dictated the rhythm now. The chair raised his gavel to maintain order, but Jasmine didn't need the help. When she raised her hand, the room went still, not out of fear, out of respect. Her next words cut even deeper, not because they were dramatic, but because they were impossible to argue with. "You didn't build an app," she said, her voice low and fierce. "You built an influence engine, then aimed it at teenagers." Another pause, another breathless second, the kind of silence that only truth can command. And then came the question, the one no executive wants to answer under oath, the one that peels away strategy, PR, and spin and leaves only the raw nerve of decision-making. "Mr. Spiegel, when did you decide that democracy was just another market to capture?" The room didn't explode. It fell silent. That kind of silence only comes when people realize they've just witnessed the moment a truth too big to ignore has been spoken aloud. The weight of Jasmine's words still hung in the air when the chair turned towards Spiegel, inviting him to respond. But no one in the room was ready for how quickly power would try to retreat behind poise. Evan Spiegel sat upright, drawing in a slow breath as if preparing for a storm that had already landed. His voice, when it came, was polished, measured down to the syllable. "That's a misunderstanding," he said, hands gently folded on the table, like a man at peace with his own version of the truth. "We do not, and have never, attempted to manipulate anyone, especially not our youngest users." He didn't raise his tone. He didn't blink. But behind his carefully chosen words was something unmistakable. Evasion. The kind that came not from guilt, but from years of knowing how to sidestep outrage without ever touching accountability. His legal team sat motionless, almost reverent, as if hoping his composure alone could put the fire out. But the room didn't relax. If anything, the tension grew heavier, like a thundercloud swelling before a second strike. Crockett didn't move. Her eyes locked on Spiegel like a hawk watching prey pretend it could fly. The press gallery was frozen, pens hovering over notepads, cameras blinking in silence. The public might have expected outrage, a raised voice, a dramatic objection. But Jasmine didn't need theatrics. She had evidence. And the more Spiegel spoke, the more the room sensed it. He wasn't defending himself. He was buying time. "We provide tool," Spiegel continued, "not influence. Suggestions, not strategies. Any patterns in behavior are incidental, not intentional." He leaned back slightly, as if placing distance between himself and the algorithmic machine his company had built. But it was too late. The line between feature and function had already been crossed, and Jasmine had been standing on the other side waiting. His denial was too clean, too mechanical. In a world where tech CEOs had rewritten public trust with the push of an update, his refusal to take responsibility felt less like defense and more like betrayal. Outside the hearing room, protesters were already gathering, parents holding photos, teens holding up signs that read, "I wasn't a target, I was a teenager." Inside, Jasmine leaned forward again, slowly this time, like a second blade being drawn. Because if Evan Spiegel thought words could save him now, he had forgotten one thing. Some truths don't fade when denied. They burn brighter. Evan Spiegel had barely finished his statement when Jasmine Crockett made her move. No theatrics, No raised voice, just a quiet, deliberate turn of a page and the slow slide of a document across the desk. The sound of paper moving across the hardwood table was almost inaudible, but its weight was felt immediately. Her hand rested atop the folder for a second longer than needed, anchoring the moment like someone steadying a truth that had waited too long to be heard. Then she spoke, eyes never leaving Spiegel. "Let the record reflect," she said evenly. "This is an unredacted advertising contract between Snap Inc. and a political action committee registered in Delaware. Name sealed under NDA, but content, not so much." Every head turned. Even the stenographer paused. This wasn't a general accusation. This was specific. This was traceable. A digital paper trail from boardroom to ballot box. Members of the committee leaned forward, eyes narrowing, as the text on the screen came into view. Clear, explicit language outlining advertising targets based on psychographic response indicators, mood-responsive behavior, and something far more chilling, teenage user volatility. In one clause, a payment was authorized specifically for targeting underage users who had recently posted content with tags like pound bored, pound angry, pound ignored. This wasn't just data. This was emotional profiling turned into a political product. And then came the real blow. Jasmine gave a subtle signal, and the chamber lights dimmed. The screen behind her came alive, not with polished infographics or polished stats, but with a single vertical cell phone video. It was grainy, personal, real. A teenage girl sat cross-legged on her unmade bed. The wallpaper behind her faded, the lighting uneven. She held her phone like it was both shield and confession booth. "I don't get it," she said softly, eyes flicking between the screen and something just off camera. "Every time I post a pic in a black hoodie, I get weird political ads. Like someone thinks I'm angry. I'm just cold." There was a moment, a flicker of uneasy laughter from someone in the gallery, but it vanished just as fast, because no one was laughing at her. What that video showed was unfiltered, unscripted vulnerability, and what it proved was something far more brutal. Someone, somewhere, had taught an algorithm to see that vulnerability as an opportunity. The silence that followed was not the dramatic kind. It was heavier, slower, like the air in the room had been sucked out and replaced with the kind of stillness that comes after an explosion, when all that remains is the sound of realization settling into every corner. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. She had already seen it, lived with it, known what it meant. She kept her eyes on Evan Spiegel, and for the first time since the hearing began, something shifted in him, a twitch in the jaw, a blink too slow. Not enough to break him, but enough to reveal that the armor was cracking. Then came the final cut, delivered with surgical calm. "So tell us, Mr. Spiegel," she said, her voice so steady it made the words sting sharper. "What was the price for packaging teenage emotion and selling it to political fear?" No one moved. Not the press, not the lawyers, not the lawmakers, because they all knew what they had just witnessed. Not a statement, not a soundbite, but a truth that couldn't be denied. And once a truth like that is spoken, there's no putting it back in the folder. And just as the silence began to settle, Jasmine flipped the next page. Because sometimes to reveal the future of a man's choices, you only have to remind him of his past. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't rush. She moved like someone who understood the weight of memory, someone who knew that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a courtroom isn't a document or a witness. It's a mirror. And today, Jasmine Crockett held one up for the entire country to see. She retrieved a single sheet of paper from the folder. No flash, no display. Just a printed email, black and white, cold and undeniable. But it might as well have been a confession carved in stone. "This isn't the first time you've looked down on the vulnerable, Mr. Spiegel," she said, voice steady as a drawn line. "It's just the first time we've had numbers, receipts, and witnesses." She placed the document gently on the table before her, not to shock, but to anchor the conversation. It was a hard copy of the leaked 2014 email thread, a digital scar from Spiegel's fraternity days at Stanford. In them, he had casually mocked the poor, reduced women to disposable entertainment, and described social power like it was currency only the rich could afford. At the time, the tech world had brushed it off. He was young, they said. He was joking. But Jasmine wasn't here to debate youth or humor. She was here to reveal continuity. Because when the privileged mock the powerless in private and are then allowed to build tools that shape public life, those private beliefs eventually become public consequences. The room reacted, not with gasps, but with a slow, collective stillness. Not everyone in that chamber remembered those emails, but Jasmine had brought them back into the light with precision. Because this wasn't about humiliation. It was about pattern recognition. What had once seemed like immature remarks now looked like early blueprints for a mindset. People as data points, power as leverage, empathy as optional. Spiegel's face didn't twitch, but his posture shifted, just slightly. The practiced calm he'd worn like a suit all morning now looked thinner, more strained. He glanced down briefly, as if trying to place himself outside the words she had just read aloud. But there was nowhere to hide from what had already been printed and sent. Jasmine didn't need volume to make her message clear. She had time. She had truth. And the world was watching. She stepped forward, not physically, but with the gravity of her tone. "You told the world you evolved," she said quietly, "that those emails were a mistake. But here we are, 10 years later, and the only thing that changed is that your words got quieter and your tools got smarter." She paused, just long enough for every eye in the room to land on Spiegel's. "You went from mocking poor kids at parties to mining their emotions for political currency." The line landed not like an insult, but like an indictment. And in that moment, the hearing room didn't feel like a government building. It felt like a courtroom, a reckoning, a place where the past wasn't just being remembered. It was finally being reckoned with. And just when it seemed Jasmine's words had pushed the room as far as it could go, she calmly reached for the microphone and said 7 words that shifted everything again. "Madam Chair, we have a witness." A wave of stillness passed through the chamber like an approaching storm. To the right of the panel, a temporary screen lit up with a blurred silhouette, indistinct but unmistakably human. No name, no visible face, just a figure behind frosted glass and layers of federal protection. The gallery leaned in, phones dropped to silent, reporters lowered their cameras. The room understood instantly. This wasn't politics anymore. This was testimony. This was someone who had been inside the machine and had chosen to speak against it. Jasmine didn't break the silence. She just gave a single respectful nod, and the speaker system crackled to life with a voice altered by a digital filter. It wasn't robotic, but it wasn't warm either. The kind of voice that has been coached to suppress fear and survive. "My name is withheld for security reasons," the voice began. "I was a senior engineer at Snap Inc. for 6 years. I worked on back-end integration for a project known internally as Phantom." The air in the room changed. What had once been political tension now felt more like a crime scene. Jasmine remained still. She wasn't leading anymore. She was listening, alongside everyone else. Project Phantom wasn't just analytics. It was surveillance. The words landed like a gavel, not shouted, not embellished, just plain and undeniable. "We created algorithms that tracked behavioral patterns of users under 18, mood shifts, clothing choices, keywords, even typing speed. These were cross-referenced with predictive political sentiment markers and sold to third parties disguised as optimization data. Every sentence struck a different nerve. One lawmaker leaned forward, lips parted, stunned. Another stared down at the papers in front of him, visibly shaken. The idea that an app designed for disappearing messages had quietly become an emotional profiling engine, it was more than controversial. It was betrayal in code. The witness paused. Not long, just enough to let the truth settle. "We were told it was legal," the voice continued, "because the terms of service buried it. But many of us knew it wasn't ethical. When I questioned the political applications of the data, I was warned, then isolated. Eventually, I was removed from the project. My security access was revoked within 48 hours. That detail, the 48 hours, cut deeper than anything abstract. It told the story of silencing from the inside, Not just dissent, but conscience. The room didn't flinch, because now every person watching knew this wasn't theoretical. This was personal. Institutional silence had faces, had targets, had systems for eliminating voices like this one. Evan Spiegel hadn't spoken, but his silence was now louder than any denial. His hands rested on the table, but the tension in his jaw gave him away. And when the voice spoke one final time, it wasn't technical. It wasn't even legal. It was heartbreak wrapped in moral clarity. I stayed quiet for 2 years, but when I saw that ad targeting a teenager based on a black hoodie and a caption that read, "Don't feel seen," I realized we weren't building tools anymore. We were building weapons. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They just stayed there, settling into the walls of the chamber like a permanent stain. Jasmine exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in recognition. The truth had finally been spoken, and no algorithm in the world could unsay it. The witness's final words, "We weren't building tools anymore. We were building weapons," still lingered in the air like smoke after detonation. For a long moment, no one moved. The room, the press, the country watching, everyone seemed suspended in the weight of what had just been said. And then, carefully, deliberately, Evan Spiegel leaned toward his microphone, not to confess, not to apologize, but to control. Because if there was one thing Spiegel had always relied on, it wasn't the power of silence, it was the power of speech. He adjusted his suit jacket, exhaled through his nose, and looked forward. Not at Jasmine, not at the whistleblower screen, but somewhere slightly above it all. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was calm, precise, and so smooth it felt almost engineered. "We believe in privacy," he said, "and we're proud of offering deeply personalized experiences that empower users to express themselves." The words floated into the air like a press release, polished, dehydrated of human weight. He continued, layering corporate language like sandbags against a flood. User safety, contextual relevance, engagement optimization. Not lies, not quite truth either. Just sterile, focus-grouped phrases designed to explain everything while meaning nothing. And yet something was wrong. The temperature in the room didn't shift. No one nodded. No one followed. It was as if the hearing had developed an immunity, a collective resistance to the kind of language that once smoothed over so many broken things. Because now everyone in that chamber had context. Context from a girl in a black hoodie, context from a frightened engineer who'd watched ethics get locked out of the code. And within that context, Spiegel's words, however polished, felt less like a defense and more like a deflection. An effort not to deny the truth, but to dull it. And when Spiegel finished, when the last of his polished phrases fell flat against the cold truth still hanging in the air, Jasmine leaned forward, opened a small white binder, and chose violence. Paperwork. She didn't posture. She didn't perform. Her voice didn't rise. But every move she made carried the quiet power of someone who had been preparing for this moment long before the camera started rolling. She turned a single page with the precision of someone exposing a hidden weapon. Not of steel, but of language. She read from the document clearly, slowly, without dramatics, because she understood something fundamental. When truth is this sharp, you don't need to raise your voice. We reserve the right to access and analyze user behavior in order to improve the service. She let the words hang in the room, not just as policy, but as indictment. You could feel the shift. That sentence wasn't new. It was familiar. Too familiar. Everyone in the room had clicked "I agree" on some version of it. It had always been there, buried beneath the euphemisms of modern design, waiting for someone to call it by its real name. Jasmine lifted her eyes from the page and fixed them squarely on Evan Spiegel. Her tone stayed calm, but there was steel under it now. "This line," she said, each word deliberate, "has been used to excuse everything. Tracking, targeting, psychological profiling of children, under the pretense of improvement." A few members of Congress glanced at one another, as if seeing the phrase for the first time not as legal padding, but as a loophole large enough to fit an entire generation of manipulation through. Jasmine leaned in slightly, not toward her mic, toward the truth. The phrase "improve the service" has been weaponized. It's no longer about functionality. It's become the legal camouflage for digital crimes. The sentence hit with surgical force. Not emotional, not rhetorical. Just fact, undeniable and immediate. Aides stopped typing. The press lowered their cameras. No one needed a headline. They had just heard the story in one sentence. Jasmine held the binder open a moment longer, her eyes not blinking, not moving. "This isn't legal clarity. This is engineered ambiguity," she continued, her voice quiet but gathering momentum like a rising tide. "And when that ambiguity allows billion-dollar systems to extract, manipulate, and influence minors without their understanding or consent, we don't call it innovation. We call it what it is." Her hand fell, firm and final, against the binder. Exploitation. That one word didn't echo. It stayed. Heavy, unmoving, unchallenged. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not in Jasmine, not in Spiegel, but in the room itself. The game was no longer about explanation. It was about consequence. And as the word exploitation settled into the silence, like a stone dropped into still water, Jasmine Crockett calmly reached for a second folder. This one was thinner, but everyone in the room understood. It might be even heavier. She didn't look up right away. She opened it slowly, flipped through 2 pages, then lifted her eyes. Not toward Evan Spiegel, not toward the cameras, but toward the committee itself. "What I'm about to present," she said evenly, "is a leaked internal document from Snap Inc. It details a covert initiative called Project Phantom." She let the name sit there in the room like a new, unfamiliar threat. No one had heard of it before. That was the point. This wasn't public policy. This wasn't buried in a website's fine print. This was something else, something built to stay hidden. Project Phantom, she continued, was not designed to improve user experience. It wasn't about safety or connection. It was about prediction, about profiling. She held up the first page and tapped the heading with her finger. This was an AI-driven political classification system, trained to sort users by political leanings, based not on what they say, but on how they act, what they wear, where they live, and even what emotion their photos suggest. Jasmine turned, and the screen behind her lit up. A slide appeared. Dark background, white font, clean corporate formatting. At the top, it read, "Test Zones, Youth Political Mapping, Target Markets, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania." And just beneath it, in yellow highlight, "Subset, Black users, ages 13 to 17, high engagement, urban, priority category." A quiet, stunned breath moved through the room. Not outrage, not noise, just the deep, sinking kind of silence that happens when people realize they're looking at something that shouldn't exist. Jasmine spoke again, gently but clearly. This wasn't a tech experiment. This was political profiling of American teenagers, specifically Black teenagers. She clicked to the next slide. It showed a heat map, clusters of color over Atlanta, Detroit, Philadelphia. It looked like any other campaign analytics map, until you read the labels: engagement scores, risk factors, emotional volatility, and most disturbingly, conversion potential. These teens weren't voters, she said. They weren't even old enough to vote, but they were already being treated like voters. Worse, like votes to be influenced, shaped, or suppressed, based entirely on race, location, and age. A senator shifted uncomfortably in his chair. A staffer stopped typing and stared at the screen. No one in that room could claim they didn't understand what they were seeing. Jasmine turned back to the committee, her voice steady and level. This wasn't just unethical, it was dangerous. Because once you build a system like this, one that sorts young people into political categories before they've even formed their own opinions, you're not predicting their beliefs, you're shaping them. Then she read directly from the final line of the internal memo. Phase 3, convert or suppress. She said nothing for a moment. She let that line echo, not through speakers, but through meaning. That's not design language, she said finally. That's strategy language. That's the language of political warfare. She looked up at Spiegel now. His face was blank, unreadable. but his hands were no longer still. This was tested in battleground states before a national election, Jasmine said. And the targets, let's be honest, were not random. They were vulnerable, young, black, easy to isolate digitally, easy to pressure without ever realizing it was happening. She held up the document again. There was no parental consent, no public disclosure, no opt-out button. Behind her, the screen displayed the final data table. Dozens of IDs, timestamps, location codes, each row representing not just a data point, but a person, a teenager, a child. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. This wasn't innovation. This was manipulation, built by adults, used on children, and hidden from everyone. She paused again, looking around the room. I want every parent watching this to understand. Your child's phone wasn't just collecting selfies. It was collecting patterns. Patterns someone decided were useful for politics, and no one told you, because they buried it in systems no human could trace until someone finally did. Another moment passed. No sound. Just the quiet click of one lawmaker's pen falling from his hand. Jasmine closed the folder. This was not a mistake. This was not an oversight. This was a design choice. And that choice crossed a line that this country can no longer afford to ignore. She folded her hands, turned off the screen, and looked back toward the panel. Her final line was not shouted, but it carried the weight of something no one could look away from. This was a digital Cold War against our own children. And in that moment, the hearing room wasn't just a room. It was a turning point. And as Jasmine closed the folder marked Project Phantom, the weight of her final words, a digital Cold War against our own children, settled into the room like the last stone dropped into a sealed grave. For a moment, no one moved. No one dared. The air was heavy with something unspoken, the recognition that something foundational had just been exposed, not only about a company, but about a country that had let it happen. Then Evan Spiegel shifted in his chair, not calmly, not strategically, but visibly unsettled, like a man who realized the script he brought no longer applied. He reached for his microphone with a sharpness that hadn't been there before. His shoulders were tight. His voice came quicker now, less polished, more personal. This wasn't branding. This was frustration, barely masked. With all due respect, he said, his voice sharp at the edges, these accusations are misleading. They're sensational. They're designed to shock, not to clarify. What we're seeing here is not oversight. It's the political weaponization of technology. He paused, waiting for the room to absorb it, but no one responded, so he kept going. Snapchat is not a partisan tool. It's a platform. And the idea that this committee would take standard engagement metrics, internal innovation projects, and twist them into a national scandal, frankly, it's irresponsible. This isn't about kids. This is about politics. And you're using my company to make a point you've already decided. His tone had fully shifted. Gone was the calm, rehearsed posture. In its place stood a CEO stripped of certainty, swinging at shadows, trying to reframe the story as something smaller, something less damning. But the words came too fast, too defensive, and the room could smell it. This was no longer control. This was panic, dressed in rhetoric. The cameras zoomed in, every eye in the hearing locked on the table. Jasmine didn't blink. She let him speak. Let him try to regain ground with talking points that no longer fit the moment. And when he finally exhaled, hands clenched, words spent, she leaned forward. No folder this time, no screen, just one sentence, one truth sharpened by everything that came before it. You're not being politicized, Mr. Spiegel, she said, her voice low and direct. You are politics, but without the responsibility of a citizen. The room went completely still. That kind of stillness only arrives when something real has been said, something that breaks through the noise, the spin, the deflections. Jasmine's words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded inevitable, like a verdict that had always been waiting. Evan didn't respond. He couldn't, because there was no language left that could argue with that line, not without proving it right. His lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. His jaw locked. And in that pause, Those 2 or 3 seconds of exposed silence, the balance of power visibly shifted. For the first time, he looked like a man seated before something bigger than himself. Jasmine continued, not louder but slower, her words cut with steel. You claim we're politicizing innovation, but let's talk about what's really happened. You built tools that could predict emotions. You turned those tools on kids. You sorted them by race, by location, by political vulnerability, and then you sold that data behind phrases like engagement and optimization. She leaned in slightly, not for drama, but for clarity. And now, when the truth is no longer under NDA, you say we're the ones being reckless? Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. The silence in the room did more than any microphone ever could. She turned back toward the committee, but her words were for everyone watching. On live streams, on phones, in classrooms, and kitchen tables across the country. Here's the difference between what you built and what we're doing here today. You built systems without consent, without oversight, without ethics, and we're shining light on them, with law, with truth, with accountability. She paused, then turned to him one last time. That's not political, Mr. Spiegel. That's democratic. A low murmur rose in the gallery, not outrage, not chaos, recognition. Outside the building, the press would catch that line in real time. Within minutes, it would trend online. Within hours, it would be printed on posters. It would flash in headlines. It would scroll across Chiron banners. And for many, it would become the sentence that defined the hearing. But inside the room, in the moments just after it was spoken, everything went quiet again. Because what Jasmine Crockett had just done wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't partisan. It was a realignment of the narrative itself. She didn't just hold Spiegel accountable. She reframed what power meant in the digital age. And as Evan Spiegel sat back in his chair, silent, blinking, still visibly unsteady, the committee moved on. Not because his voice no longer mattered, but because the truth no longer needed it. The words still echoed in the chamber. You were politics, but without the responsibility of a citizen, when a shift swept through the room. It wasn't loud, it wasn't fast, but it was real. Power was moving. For hours, the hearing had been a battlefield of facts and silence, of carefully built denials and surgical truths. But now, for the first time since it began, that battlefield felt like it had turned into a courtroom. One by one, members of the subcommittee leaned into whispered conversations with their aides. Some scribbled notes. Others stared at the folders in front of them as if they now held something radioactive. You could feel it. Something irreversible had taken place. This was no longer a hearing. It was a decision point. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her work was already written in the room, in the stunned eyes of the committee, in the stillness of Evan Spiegel, in the raw data glowing quietly on the screens behind them. It wasn't outrage that moved people now. It was clarity. Chairwoman Natalie Mendoza, a moderate from Arizona, who had remained mostly silent throughout the hearing, finally leaned into her mic. Given the totality of the evidence presented, verbal testimony, internal documentation, and whistleblower disclosures, this subcommittee is empowered to vote on an emergency motion to refer the full contents of the record to the United States Department of Justice for federal investigation. Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers gripped the edge of the desk like she understood the weight of what she had just set in motion. A brief pause followed, just long enough to let the room breathe before something changed again. Is there a motion on the floor? Jasmine didn't hesitate. She leaned in, calm but resolute. So moved. Is there a second? Seconded, came a voice from the right, a Republican, older, hawkish, previously skeptical. Now silent, eyes down, ashamed. The vote was official. Staffers moved swiftly to prepare the digital tally. Each member of the subcommittee was handed a tablet. One by one, their names were called in alphabetical order. Behind each name, the question, do you vote to refer the case and its supporting materials to the Department of Justice for further criminal investigation? Each yes was firm, final, not shouted, but dropped like stones in water. The first few came quickly. Then there was a pause, a flicker of hesitation from the senator from Kansas, who had earlier asked if emotion detection could really be proven. He pressed his screen. Yes, that was the eighth. By the time the 10th vote was cast, the energy in the room had shifted. No longer tense, determined. Even the opposition began to understand that this was not a partisan gesture. It was a moral reckoning. The 11th vote came from a Democrat who had once received campaign donations from Snap's parent lobbying firm. He didn't blink when he pressed yes. All eyes turned to the last seat. Representative Nolan Franks of North Carolina, a libertarian, tech-friendly, always the lone voice of caution against over-regulating Silicon Valley. He looked pale. His fingers hovered over the screen. He stared at it for several long seconds. Then he turned on his mic. "I believe this sets a dangerous precedent," he said, "but the precedent was set by the company, not this committee." No further comment. "I vote no." The gavel dropped. "By a vote of 12 to 1, the motion carries," Mendoza said. Her voice was calm, but it echoed like thunder. A staffer immediately stepped out of the chamber, escorting a sealed envelope to the Justice Department liaison office located 2 floors below. Reporters stood. Phones lit up. The gallery broke its vow of stillness, not with noise, but with movement, as if everyone realized they had just watched a lever of government shift. But the center of it all, the eye of the storm, was Jasmine Crockett. She remained seated, still, steady, her expression unreadable. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Because she understood something essential about moments like this. They're not victories. They're beginnings. Across from her, Evan Spiegel sat frozen. His counsel whispered in his ear. He nodded but didn't speak. For the first time in his career, the man who had once defined youth culture with a tap and a filter no longer controlled the lens. As the hearing adjourned and the gavel struck its final blow, the echo didn't stop at Capitol Hill. It traveled through fiber lines, broadcast towers, satellites, and within hours the country was no longer watching history unfold. It was living inside it. By 4:27 p.m. Eastern Time, just 72 minutes after the vote, Snap Inc.'s stock had dropped 17% in a single trading block. 22 hedge funds triggered automated sell-offs within 10 minutes of each other. Terminals buzzed. Analysts froze. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, traders exchanged no words, just glances. Everyone knew what they were looking at wasn't a correction, it was a collapse. At Snap headquarters in Santa Monica, the damage came not just through numbers, but through silence. Screens turned red. Phones stopped ringing. One executive stared at a Bloomberg terminal like it had just announced the end of oxygen. Inside the C-suite boardroom, a risk advisor finally said it out loud. "We just lost $6.3 billion in 6 hours." But the markets were only the beginning. On social media, the outrage spread like an electrical storm across every platform. Within 90 minutes, Snap Leak was trending globally. At 2 hours, Children Not Data surpassed 1 million tweets. By nightfall, TikTok creators were posting tearful responses, comparing Jasmine Crockett's words to the civil rights hearings of the 1960s. Screenshots of Project Phantom documents lit up Instagram stories like flashbangs. One viral clip showed a 16-year-old in Atlanta holding up her phone and saying, "I'm not a voter. So why was I a target?" And then came the hashtag that hit hardest, Snap for Profit. It was simple, brutal, honest. A phrase that framed the entire scandal in just 3 words, and it took off like wildfire. Lawmakers tweeted it, teachers posted it, celebrities reposted Jasmine's speech with captions like, "This is what accountability sounds like." Within 12 hours, civil rights attorneys were filing amicus briefs in anticipation of DOJ involvement. And for the first time in Snap Inc.'s history, major advertisers began to pull out publicly. But the internet wasn't the only place where movement stirred. At 6:45 a.m. the next morning, long before LA traffic reached its peak, 6 unmarked black Suburbans pulled into Snap's global headquarters on the corner of 26th and Broadway. The sidewalk was quiet. Security stood still. But the moment the first agent stepped out, windbreaker zipped, badge displayed. The message was clear. This was no longer PR crisis control. This was federal. By the time the 5th agent stepped inside, a sealed warrant had been delivered to the company's compliance officer. It carried the official header, United States Department of Justice, Criminal Investigations Division, Case ID Phantom X512. The agents didn't shout. They didn't rush. They moved like people who already knew exactly where to go. First to the server room, then to legal, then to the West Side engineering wing where Project Phantom's digital skeleton still lived, hidden deep inside a code base that was no longer deniable. Outside, a crowd began to gather. Not protesters yet, just civilians, employees, neighbors, a few holding phones, a few holding signs. One woman held a cardboard poster that simply read, "My son was 14. He had no idea." Inside, two agents escorted the lead internal counsel into a soundproof meeting room. Another agent quietly requested access to encrypted comms channels used between product teams and political consultants. By 10:13 a.m., at least 3 Snap executives had retained federal criminal defense attorneys. By 11:42, Evan Spiegel's personal assistant deleted her LinkedIn profile. Back in Washington, Jasmine Crockett held no press conference. She didn't gloat. Instead, she issued one statement, a single paragraph, handwritten, posted as a photo on her official account. If companies are powerful enough to shape how our children see the world, then they must be accountable enough to answer for how they use that power. The vote is done. The facts are public. The law will follow. Representative Jasmine Crockett, May 10th. That post was reshared over 2 million times within 24 hours. Meanwhile, Snap's legal team scrambled to manage the hemorrhage. Outside counsel began negotiating early cooperation. Internal Slack logs were frozen. A PR firm issued a carefully worded statement. Snap Inc. is fully committed to transparency and welcomes the opportunity to clarify any misconceptions. But the world wasn't waiting for clarification. The world had moved on to consequences. By mid-afternoon, stock had dropped a full 31%. A class action lawsuit was filed in New York. Congressional leaders called for broader hearings on youth data manipulation across all tech platforms. And in a chilling echo of history, commentators began calling this moment the new Cambridge Analytica. Only worse because this time, the targets were children. The FBI agents exited the building just before 4 p.m., carrying 3 encrypted drives, 2 document boxes, and 1 laptop under seal. They said nothing to the cameras. They didn't need to. The footage spoke for itself. One headline captured the mood of the country with eerie precision. Snapchat promised vanishing messages, but what it left behind may never be forgotten. The FBI vans had barely left Santa Monica when a new blow landed, not from government subpoenas or stock market crashes, but from within the fortress itself. At 6:42 p.m. Pacific, a private internal email thread from Snap Inc.'s executive Slack channel leaked to 3 major outlets simultaneously, the New York Times, ProPublica, and Axios. The message marked confidential eyes only was written by Evan Spiegel himself just hours after the congressional hearing concluded. It was never meant to be seen outside the walls of the company, but by the time the clock struck midnight, it had become the most widely shared internal memo in Silicon Valley history. His words were raw, stripped of corporate polish, honest, perhaps too honest. We believed we could shape politics through innovation, that by controlling the tools we could steer the outcomes. But politics doesn't stay still. It learns, it adjusts, it watches. I thought we had mastered the system, but today I realized the truth. We didn't control politics with technology. Politics just waited for its chance to strike back. The quote hit the internet like a thunderclap. No denials, no spin. Just quiet, wounded acknowledgement that the empire hadn't crumbled from pressure outside. It had collapsed from misreading its own power. By dawn, the memo was on the front page of nearly every major news site. One headline from The Guardian distilled it down to a single devastating sentence. Snap built the weapon. Jasmine pulled the trigger. And yet, the fallout didn't pause. Because Evan Spiegel's admission didn't just mark the end of a company's innocence, it kicked open the door to the rest of Silicon Valley. Within 48 hours, congressional subpoenas were issued to Meta, Google, TikTok, and Amazon Web Services. No longer confined to Snap, the investigation had become something far larger, a systemic probe into the secret world of predictive data, emotional targeting, and algorithmic influence across the digital landscape. Tech CEOs scrambled to prepare. Whispered calls lit up DC and Palo Alto like fiber optic brush fires. PR firms worked overtime to pre-write statements of concern, transparency, and collaboration. Lawyers began drafting memos warning of constitutional overreach, but none of it moved public opinion. The ground had already shifted, and Jasmine Crockett was standing in the center of the fault line. Across the country, a new generation of citizens, students, parents, educators, began reposting clips from her hearing with words like, "She said what no one else would," and finally, "Someone understands data isn't neutral." One TikTok compilation of Jasmine's final line, "You are politics, but without the responsibility of a citizen," racked up 18 million views in 2 days. Teachers printed it on posters, protesters stenciled it onto cardboard, tech workers whispered it to each other over coffee like a warning and a prayer. And so, whether she wanted it or not, Jasmine Crockett became the unexpected symbol of a new era. The headlines followed quickly. Politico, Crockett's crusade. Can one hearing reshape data ethics in America? Time magazine, the woman who brought Silicon Valley to its knees. Wired, from engagement to exploitation, why Jasmine Crockett is tech's worst nightmare. But for Jasmine, the spotlight was never the goal. When asked by reporters how she felt becoming the face of a movement, she gave the same calm answer she'd given in the hearing room. "This isn't about attention, this is about alignment. Power without accountability isn't innovation, it's erosion." Behind closed doors, the backlash grew fiercer. A leaked meeting at Meta revealed senior staff asking if they needed to suspend similar emotion tagging systems just in case. Google's internal memo warned executives not to use phrases like voter micro-targeting in any public setting. And at TikTok's US policy office, one compliance director simply wrote in Slack, "We're next, brace." The White House, sensing a cultural shift too big to ignore, issued a formal statement the next morning. The federal government takes seriously any use of data technologies to profile, target, or manipulate American youth without informed consent. We are reviewing all options to ensure transparency and protection in the digital age. By the end of the week, 3 other congressional committees had opened formal inquiries into AI influence operations, youth data commodification, and partisan algorithm design. And through it all, Jasmine didn't step back. She didn't capitalize. She went back to work, holding listening sessions with parents, inviting engineers to testify anonymously, and drafting a legislative proposal titled the Digital Consent and Protection Act, Restoring Trust in American Technology. Her office became flooded with letters, not from lobbyists, but from parents, teachers, even kids. "I didn't know what an algorithm was, but now I think one might have shaped how I see myself." Sierra, age 16, Philadelphia. "We teach our kids not to talk to strangers, but now we're realizing the apps we trusted were the ones listening the most." Gabriella L., mother of 2. "I used to believe tech was neutral. I don't anymore. Thank you for showing us what it really is." Ethan W., data scientist, Seattle. By the 3rd week, Jasmine was invited to speak before the European Parliament on digital privacy and ethical AI. She declined, not out of pride, out of focus. "I didn't fight this battle to go global," she said. "I fought it to go local, so every kid in America understands their rights before someone turns them into a product." Meanwhile, Snap Inc. remained under investigation. Multiple executives had lawyered up. Internal morale was at an all-time low. Advertisers continued pulling out, and Evan Spiegel, once a tech darling, now a cautionary tale, was no longer appearing in public. The man who once reshaped how a generation saw itself through lenses and filters had finally come face to face with something his platform couldn't distort: the truth. She had never asked to become a symbol, but when the dust settled, after the subpoenas, the raids, the leaked emails, and the markets fell silent, Jasmine Crockett stood in front of a nation not to claim victory, but to deliver a warning. The steps of the Capitol were unusually quiet for a midday press conference. There were no banners, no celebration, just journalists shoulder to shoulder, equipment blinking, pens poised. Everyone knew this moment wasn't for headlines. It was for history. Jasmine Crockett stepped to the podium in a simple black suit. No flag pin, no partisan lapel, no entourage. Only a small binder in her hands and a silence behind her that said more than any staffer ever could. She took a breath, looked past the cameras, and spoke like she had in that hearing room, with unshakable calm and the kind of clarity that can't be rehearsed, only earned. Data is not the new oil, she said. Data is identity. It is not a resource. It is a reflection. And identity, she continued, pausing just enough for the words to sink in, is not for sale. No one moved. The sentence landed with the gravity of a gavel. Simple, final, not a slogan, a truth. She continued, her voice slow, deliberate. For too long, we've let companies hide behind algorithms, claiming neutrality while monetizing emotion, race, fear, and childhood. We've accepted terms of service we never read, surrendered ourselves to machines we don't understand, and watched an entire generation be sorted, targeted, and sold in real time. She turned a page in her binder, not as performance, but like marking a page in the country's moral ledger. We were told this was innovation, she said, but what it really was permission. Silent, assumed permission to turn human behavior into profit, without conscience, without consent, and without accountability. Behind her, the Capitol dome loomed, catching a ray of sun through gathering clouds. A quiet wind swept through the microphones as if even nature had paused to listen. That era ends now, she said, because technology does not erase responsibility. It magnifies it. She looked up. Director. No notes, no glance to aides. Just Jasmine and the weight of a nation watching. You cannot claim to serve democracy while harvesting its citizens. The crowd didn't cheer. No one applauded. The moment was too heavy for that. But across the press line, heads lowered. Pens slowed. Because what they had just witnessed wasn't a campaign speech. It was a line in the sand. And she had drawn it in front of everyone. That night, the clip aired on every major network within minutes. Not edited, not trimmed. Played in full. By morning, it had gone viral across the globe. It was uploaded in 23 languages, subtitled by volunteers, taught in classrooms, cited in op-eds. One influencer described it as the first speech since MLK that made me feel like the future might actually depend on what we do next. But perhaps the most haunting moment wasn't even Jasmine's words. It came in a 14-second video recorded by a high school student in Ohio, stitched with footage of the hearing, the FBI raid, and Jasmine's final sentence. The screen went black and a single line of white text appeared, one that would be reshared over 80 million times in 72 hours. Is America being rewritten by code no one controls? The question echoed far beyond social media. By the end of the week, Congress formally opened the first nationwide hearing on the rights of citizens in the digital age. Its title, Civic Identity in the Algorithmic Era, Reclaiming Control of Our Data. In a rare bipartisan move, both chambers agreed to hold it jointly. Not because they agreed on the solutions, but because they could no longer ignore the problem. The hearing room was packed wall to wall. Students, professors, parents, even former tech executives who had once lobbied to delay exactly this kind of conversation. Now they sat silent, eyes lowered, waiting to be asked questions they could no longer dodge. In opening remarks, Chairwoman Mendoza spoke only one sentence before yielding the floor. Today, we are not regulating platforms. We are reasserting personhood. And with that, the door opened, not just to legislation, but to something deeper, a cultural reckoning. Meanwhile, Jasmine didn't attend the hearing in person. She watched from her district office in Texas, seated beside a group of high school students. When asked why she didn't fly to D.C., she smiled and answered, "Because it's not about me anymore. It's about what we build next." One student beside her leaned over and whispered, "But you started it." Jasmine shook her head. "No," she said, "I just stopped pretending it wasn't happening." Across the country, change didn't erupt. It ignited slowly, quietly, like embers beneath the surface. Local school boards began demanding transparency from edtech platforms. Privacy legislation passed in 5 states within 6 months. Several universities introduced required courses on data ethics, and a national nonpartisan group, Children Not Data, was founded, with Jasmine listed not as president, but as first witness. Tech companies scrambled to adapt. Meta suspended 3 internal programs pending legal review. Google revised its privacy policy for minors. TikTok voluntarily submitted its emotion tagging software for independent audit. For the first time, the tide had turned not from regulation alone, but from public moral pressure. The rules were still being written, but the silence that once surrounded them, that was broken forever. In the final scene of a documentary released months later, the camera pans slowly across the hearing room, empty now, its rows of seats still and quiet. Jasmine's voice played over it, not staged, just a recording from that last press conference. We used to think identity was something fixed. Your name, your face, your voice. But in the digital age, identity is 1,000 invisible fingerprints left behind in search bars, scroll patterns, and unfinished messages. And if we don't defend it, if we let it be redefined by those who see people as patterns and patterns as profit, we will lose more than privacy. We'll lose the story of who we are. Then the screen went black, and one final question appeared. If democracy is written in laws, but lived through data, who holds the pen? Fade to silence. The headlines faded. The hearings ended. The screens went dark. But something deeper remained. A question far older than algorithms and more urgent than legislation. What happens when a society forgets what a person is worth? Jasmine Crockett never set out to be a hero. She never wanted to become the symbol of a digital revolution. What she wanted, what she still wants, is harder to define. It's not justice in the abstract. It's not vengeance. It's clarity, accountability. A return to something we were all supposed to understand. That human identity is not a product. It is not a variable. It is not a profit line. It is sacred. In every closed-door meeting, in every leaked memo, she had seen the same thing. A system that had learned to talk about people without seeing them. Teenagers became targets. Emotions became metrics. Race, age, trauma. They were just segments in a campaign. Not one engineer ever stopped to ask what it meant to predict fear in a 13-year-old. Not one executive ever paused to wonder what it meant to watch a child spiral because a line of code had decided they were highly influenceable. And maybe that was the most dangerous part. Not the greed, not even the algorithms, the silence. Because when people stop asking questions about what they're building, when they stop seeing faces and only see patterns, that's when harm becomes invisible. That's when injustice scales. That's when power forgets it ever had a conscience. Jasmine had faced more than public attacks. She had endured backroom threats, corporate smear attempts, and political isolation. She'd been called reckless, unprofessional, even a data demagogue by one tech columnist who later deleted his account. But through it all, she had held her ground, not out of pride, but out of principle, because she understood what too many in power had forgotten. When systems fail to treat people as people, the results don't look like accidents. They look like patterns of pain. And that was the lesson, the real one. Not that data is dangerous, but that forgetting who it belongs to is. We live in an age where identity has become fragmented, broken into clicks, likes, biometric scans, browser histories, facial recognition logs, and sentiment scores. We carry ourselves in devices, speak to each other through interfaces, and exist across servers more than we do across tables. And slowly, without ever signing a real contract, we accepted that this was normal. But Jasmine didn't. She stood in front of power and said, "This isn't normal. This is exploitation dressed up as personalization." She reminded the world that privacy isn't the opposite of visibility. It's the foundation of dignity. That to track someone's behavior without consent isn't innovation. It's surveillance. And that when you turn someone's pain into an opportunity for engagement, you haven't built a community. You've built a machine that feeds on the very thing it pretends to protect. Her story isn't about punishment. It's about pause, about reflection. Because in the quiet that followed her final press conference, after the hashtags cooled and the market stabilized, a new kind of conversation began. In classrooms, in kitchen tables, in boardrooms. A conversation about what it means to rebuild trust in a world that had been engineered to erode it. That's the legacy, not the subpoenas, not the laws. The lesson, that a 14-year-old in Georgia is not a test subject. That a mother's grief over a son radicalized by algorithm is not anecdotal. That democracy is not only protected in courtrooms, but in code bases. And that the next revolution won't be televised or monetized. It will be recognized in every small human decision to say, no, a person is not a product. And this story ends here. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.